So chapter 22 is probably one of my favorite chapters to cover in biochemistry. And part of that's because we take all of these details that we've been learning for so many weeks here, and we finally put them in the context of the human body and kind of understand how they all work. And so even though there's not a lot that's truly new that we learn in this chapter, we really learn about the importance of how this relates to, like I said, human metabolism, because we are a multicellular eukaryote. So kind of concepts and goals to think about for this lecture in particularly, the big picture concept is that we need to understand that all the biochemistry you've been learning about needs to be done within and between different cell types. So again, we'll review those major metabolic pathways that we've talked about that involve proteins, protein metabolism, glycogen, so carbohydrate metabolism, and then triacylglycerol, so lipid metabolism. So we'll go through, and there's a figure in your text that I'll ask you to kind of make sure that you review and understand all of those concepts. New stuff, and if you've taken a physiology course, you've probably covered some of these when you've discussed your different organ systems. We're going to talk about five main kind of organs and kind of talk about the cells that are there and how they perform biochemistry differently. We'll talk about the brain, specifically skeletal muscle, although we will mention cardiac muscle, adipose tissue, the liver, and the kidney. And if you kind of understand how biochemistry works within those organs, you have a pretty good handle as to how biochemistry kind of functions in the human body. We'll talk about and review some important branch point metabolites like glucose 6-phosphate pyruvate and acetyl-CoA, and we'll think about how they affect biochemistry in these specific tissues. And then importantly, with regards to the liver and the kidney, we'll discuss their ability to buffer glucose levels. So again, the liver's responsibility in kind of maintaining homeostatic glucose levels, and then the kidney in terms of buffering blood pH. So again, those are the concepts and goals we'll have with today's lecture. We're going to have about 4 or 5 figures that we'll kind of use to discuss those in detail in our activity. But just kind of as a big picture thing for us to think about, this is not anything we'll talk about specifically in any activity. When we think about where we've kind of focused ourselves with biochemistry thus far, we've been talking about kind of the molecular events that happen with biochemical processes. We have from time to time kind of talked about different cell types that maybe do certain biochemistry. So maybe we've talked about hepatic cells, so cells in the liver versus skeletal muscle cells. But again, we have to remember that these basically cells are part of a large tissue, which is likely part of an organ and part of an organ system, and then in the mammalian system, obviously part of a larger organism. So some concepts that we'll kind of touch on in our activity, but won't spend a lot of time on, is this concept of substrate cycling. So again, the idea of breaking down lipids and recycling lipids or things like that. When we think about substrate cycles within a cell, it might seem like it's rather futile. But when we talk about some of these processes between cells, now all of a sudden they might have kind of some metabolic meaning. We'll also talk about kind of the ability to change what we're doing in a metabolic standpoint depending on what the cellular needs are. What's going on with the cell developmentally? Are we a growing embryo that's developing into a fetus and there's lots of cell differentiation that needs to be taking place? Or are we in kind of a later stage of development where there's not a lot of cell growth that's going on? So a lot of things can be regulated by different metabolic processes there. And then importantly, when we're talking about communication between these different tissues and different systems, the nerve system is going to be obviously very important in kind of regulating external signals, and then hormones are an important way of relaying those signals via the circulatory system to different tissues. So kind of a big picture thing to always keep in mind that we've been very focused on this end of the spectrum, and this chapter allows us to think about this larger piece. So again, 6 areas really that we'll talk about, 5 tissues, but again we need to think about the blood as a mechanism of transport. We'll spend some time going through a very detailed analysis of these 5 tissues, so the brain, skeletal muscle, adipose tissue, liver, and kidney. These numbers that I have here kind of really reflect kind of the degree of metabolic activity that occurs in each of these tissues. So the liver is probably the most metabolically active tissue. pretty much every pathway that we've learned about can take place in the liver. And maybe a little bit surprisingly, the next most metabolic tissue in terms of its activity is the adipose tissue. And again, skeletal muscle, even though it's fairly selfish, we'll kind of name all of these tissues and kind of give them little nicknames that help us remember kind of the types of things that they do. Skeletal muscle, again, a very metabolically active tissue, but a very selfish tissue because most of that metabolism is to serve its own needs. So again, this is the figure that I was indicating that I want you guys to be able to take a look at and understand all of these details. There's 2 pages in your textbook. That's the level of detail that you'll need to understand with these processes. So for example, with glycolysis, you do not need to remember every single structure of glycolysis for this chapter, but you do need to know the purpose of glycolysis, where it occurs, important branch point metabolites like glucose 6-phosphate and so forth. So there's 2 pages in your textbook. Make sure that you do know those fairly well. We're going to spend the bulk of our time in class with this figure, and we're going to just kind of write a whole bunch of stuff on it, answering a bunch of questions to think about the different kinds of things that happen within each of these 5 tissues. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this right now. We're going to save that for our activity. We'll also have a couple figures that we'll dissect to help us think about some interesting aspects of metabolism, and one is this kind of temporal sequence of where we get our energy from. And then, again, it depends on whether we're anaerobic or aerobic and the kinds of metabolites we use to provide that energy. So we've talked about this before, but we'll again break it apart and think about it in the context of this chapter. We'll also, again, kind of do a little review of kinetics and look at how the liver is able to buffer blood glucose levels. And it has to do with the activity of 2 different enzymes and how they differentially will allow for the uptake of glucose. And that's pretty much it for this section. We'll move on. We'll probably have 4 or 5 lectures that we'll deal with this chapter. The next lecture is going to deal with hormones, and so we're going to learn about these processes in the context of these tissues, and then we'll superimpose as to how hormones regulate that activity. And then we'll spend the last 2, maybe even 3 lectures kind of getting into some new details in terms of how this all regulates in terms of the larger organism. And so thinking of things even like appetite and kind of feeling satiated or a full feeling. Thinking about how this relates to diabetes, metabolic syndrome, kind of some important disease states that result from an imbalance in metabolism. So that'll be it for our first lecture on integrative fuel metabolism.